Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Cimmerian September. This is a BookTube event created by Michael K. Vaughan, of course, our resident Cimmerian, designed to celebrate Conan. Designed to celebrate the original Robert E. Howard Conan stories. You can see them up there. That's the big Gollancz one volume. You could also get the 3 Del Rey trade paperbacks that present Conan, the Conan stories, the Conan fragments, the Conan novel, the way that Robert E. Howard wrote them, and in the order that he wrote them, and without any emendations or changes or pastiches from anybody else, from any later hands, no matter how good their intentions were. I've been having a ball with Cimmerian September. I've heard from a number of you that you are too, including, I'd say about a dozen people who've emailed me. I leave my email on every video. Feel free to email me about anything. You could also Voxer me. I've heard from about a dozen people saying, the combination of you and Michael K. Vaughan was too much for me to resist, so I finally read a Conan story, and I think I get what you're talking about, why you love this so much. I think we've made a couple of Conan fans, which is wonderful. That's always the goal here. Also, all of the people who said, I was getting it from him, I was getting it from you, I finally decided to try Conan, to, try a story or whatnot. All of those people also parenthetically mentioned that Michael K. Vaughan and I are their 2 favorite BookTube channels, and several people have said over the years that we're the only 2 BookTube channels that you watch regularly, that you don't miss anything, which is astonishing. That is an astonishing compliment. But I have been leaving that volume up on the shelf. I have all of it. I have ebooks of all of that on my Kindle, so that volume doesn't need to come down off the shelf, which technically means it doesn't need to be here, but that's a conversation for another day. I have been reading Marvel Comics' original run on a magazine, a black and white magazine called The Savage Sword of Conan, which they did as a follow-up to their color comic book, Conan the Barbarian. This thing would not have been on a normal comic book rack. It would not have been where children could find it, because it was more explicit in terms of semi-nudity and more explicit in terms of explicit violence. And Roy Thomas was the writer for both, forever and ever, for Conan the Barbarian and The Savage Sword of Conan. And Savage Sword, I bought it. It was expensive, much more expensive than a comic book, but I bought it faithfully because I was deeply head over heels in love with the Conan oeuvre, and was willing to take any adventures that any good writer would do. Roy Thomas really is a good Conan writer. I was also a big fan of his go-to artist, John Buscema. I've always liked Buscema's work, even when it's a little overdone, a little overdramatic, as it is, for instance, in his much-lauded run on The Silver Surfer. But there was the law of diminishing returns when it came to Savage Sword of Conan. I didn't always love every issue, and I seemed to love every successive issue a little less than I loved the one before it. So I eventually stopped getting Savage Sword of Conan. At around issue 100, 150, something like that, the later issues that I've been reading for Savage Sword of September, I did not recognize at all. But I went back to double digits for today's episode of Cimmerian September. I went back to Savage Sword of Conan number 52. And you can see the cover there tells the story. At last, Conan becomes king. This is a story, this is sort of a prequel to a story that we saw just the other day. We saw a much later story in Savage Sword of Conan, where Conan has to deal with a treacherous wench and a treacherous wizard, Thulandra Thu, who were involved. They were deeply in cahoots with Numenides, the king of Aquilonia, when Conan actually kills him and takes the crown of Aquilonia, the greatest kingdom of the Hyborian era. And this is the issue that tells that, which, of course, that is not a story that Robert E. Howard directly told. Instead, this is adapting a novel by Elspeth de Camp and Lynn Carter, who were 2 of the people who did the pastiched and mocked up Conan volumes that introduced a whole generation to Conan the Barbarian, but weren't the pure, undefiled Robert E. Howard. Mike's done a whole video on the De Camp and Lynn Carter Conan volumes and excoriates them for that is not the way you treat your primary sources, no matter what it is. I'm sure that he would agree with me. I've made the same point, for instance, about the parallel lives of Plutarch from 2,000 years before Robert E. Howard, that are routinely chopped up into, here are some noteworthy Greek lives, here are some noteworthy Roman lives. When's the last time that people treated that book as one whole? And I've always called for that. That should be done. We shouldn't treat classics this way, even if they're modern classics. Nevertheless, I have a soft spot for those old Elsbreg de Camp and Lynn Carter Conan books. I don't think they're as wildly off character for Conan as a lot of times people have accused them of being. And I love them. For me, they're synonymous with long, lazy, hot summers. Just reveling in those books. In my own defense, the original, uncut, unchanged Robert E. Howard stories were impossible to find, relatively impossible to find when I was reading those books. I imagine that's everybody's story. But this is an adaptation of a story by Elsbreg de Camp and Lynn Carter about how Conan actually takes the throne of Aquilonia. It's written by Roy Thomas, and it's drawn by John Buscema, but he's inked by Tony DiZuniga. And Tony DiZuniga, I'm a big fan of comic book artwork. I read comics for the artwork, not for the story. And I was, for a long time, in the 70s and the early 80s, sort of a bit of a connoisseur of John Buscema's inkers, because they can each radically change his work. And I haven't typically liked what Tony DiZuniga does with his artwork. It might have been the recurrent appearance of Tony DiZuniga as his inker that sort of started to cool me on Savage Sword of Conan. And looking at this issue from 1980, from the year 1980, when all the world made sense. Looking at this issue, I don't see many of my old complaints. So maybe this is broadening the mind. This is an adaptation of the book Conan the Liberator. Starts with this splash panel of General Conan looking at his troops. And that is wonderful. I don't object to that at all, Tony DiZuniga inking or not. Conan is conferring with his men, including an amateur sort of hedge wizard. He's conferring with his men about the state of affairs in Aquilonia and whether or not he and his band of soldiers might be in a position to strike at Aquilonia, which is kind of an unthinkable thought. It would require dealing with the wizard. They know they have to deal with Thulandra Thu. They know they have to do that. And that's tricky. The hedge wizard that Conan has in his employ thinks he might be able to blunt the impact of those sorceries, and that's enough for a go-ahead. All they need now is someone willing to confront the king in the presence of his wizard. And a whole bunch of names are brooded. See, this is not that bad in terms of artwork. A whole bunch of names are brooded, and Conan decides, these are all good names. They all have pluses and minuses. There's only one clear choice. I'll do it myself, which is a classic Conan story. And off they go. And then the scene shifts to the palace. And Roy Thomas gives this a very leisurely pace. Once we shift to the palace, this is a leisurely adaptation. And I like it for that. I very much do. You get big, generous panels like this. There is the king. And he thinks he's a god. But he's afraid of the dark, so he's got candles lit everywhere. That is just a lovely panel. And I don't know, maybe 40 years ago I would have looked at that and thought, well, it would have been even more lovely if somebody else had inked it, but I don't see that now. This looks just fine. All of the textures are there, everything. I don't think any of Buscema's work is blunted at all. But we get the king, and we also get Alcina, who is the wench we saw in that later story who betrays Conan. And in the later story, we learn that he banishes her. If you set foot in my kingdom again, you'll die, but I won't have you killed. And in that later story, there has to be a comeuppance with her. But in this story, she's got another problem on her hands, which is that the king is getting a little grabby, and she's trying to keep away from him. See, she's bare-breasted. Couldn't do that in Conan the Barbarian. You could do it in this color magazine, because technically this was supposed to be kept away from children. And the king is just about to grab her when he is confronted with Thulandra Thu. And he thinks, well, I'll use my sword, I'll kill you with it. I don't need to take orders from you. He swings at Thulandra Thu, but it is no contest at all. And Thulandra Thu actually tells him, he states it very clearly. Where is it here? I want to find the exact spot. Oh, no, I passed over it here. You reign here, but you do not rule. I do. The king is maddened with rage that would be the case, but when Thulandrathu's staff knocks his sword away, it actually cuts him. And he's bleeding like a mortal. He's amazed that he can bleed. And that calms him down some, so that Thulandrathu is actually able to talk with him about internal pressures in the city and all sorts of other issues that are pressing, that need their attention. It's Alcina who mentions one other thing that you might want to consider, which is, what about Conan? What about Conan and his rebel army? And Thulandrathu dismisses it completely. I cannot say, but it surely cannot be that a rebel army, which I know is pinned down, they will soon retreat in the face of hopeless odds. We have nothing more to fear from them. And she says the barbarian is resourceful. I wouldn't put it past him. The wizard has other concerns that he wants to share with the king. And he says, unless you can better control yourself, I shall have to do away with you and rule directly instead of through you. Remember, that was what he planned to do in the later story that we read earlier in Cimmerian September. And the king says, you will never be king. Not a man in Aquilonia would obey you. You are not royal blood. You are not an Aquilonian. I begin to doubt if you are even human. Thulandrathu is entirely human. But they are debating with all of this when suddenly a terrified page comes to the door and tells them Conan and his army are inside the palace. so much for dismissing him. They're inside the palace. And soon, look at that. Look at that. That's terrific. Did I ever fault Tony DiZuniga for that? That is lovely. Absolutely lovely. They show up. Another leisurely splash panel here. There is Conan's wizard protecting Conan from what he knows is coming. See, Thulandrathu is going to strike him, but it doesn't hurt him because he's protected by his own wizard. Who's not as strong as Thulandrathu, but is able at least to do that. Once again, just as he did with the king, Thulandrathu threatens Conan with a wooden staff. Conan thinks, what madness is this? I have a sword. That's no good. But he can't get close. Thulandrathu seems to be surrounded by a Gandalf-style invisible force field. And it isn't enough to strike Conan down, but it is enough to protect him from Conan. And Conan says that he's just going to keep going, that he's just going to keep trying, until Thulandrathu has a sudden change of heart. He says, I see now that Aquilonia is unworthy of the effort I have wasted upon it. I shall remove to a land beyond the sunrise, where people will value my experiments and the gift of life eternal. Farewell. And she says, the king says, you can't leave. She says, you can't leave. But he does. He just disappears. Conan says, back up all you want, wizard. The invisible barrier retreats with you, and where it goes, I go. And Thulandrathu says, they call you the lion, and now I see why. You are like that shaggy predator, relentless in stalking your chosen prey. And Conan says, I, Thulandrathu, and I'll stalk clean to hell if that's what it takes to stick this sword through your guts. But Thulandrathu is not interested in being eviscerated. He doesn't actually get eviscerated, as we saw in that later story. He gets rather violently decapitated. But that leaves the king, who begs Conan for mercy. He says, you look at this artwork. How could I ever have criticized this? He says, you wouldn't kill an unarmed man. Would you all go into exile? You'll never hear from me again. And Conan says, I don't hunt mice. You're not worth my time. And discards him. And while Conan's not looking, he grabs a dagger in an attempt to take Conan's life. And that is all it takes. He strangles him to death and takes his crown. Another classic moment. Keep in mind, this is not Robert E. Howard. This is Elsperag de Camp. But I think Elsperag de Camp really understood Conan. He kills King Numidides and takes his crown, puts it on his own head, turns to all the assembled soldiers and says, well, how does it look? And they hail him as, for the first time ever, King Conan. And you might think that's where the story ends. He banishes Alcina, the traitoress. He banishes her. And you might think that's where the story ends, but it doesn't. It doesn't. Elsperag de Camp and Roy Thomas make sure to include a postscript where Conan is on his throne with his crown being confronted by paperwork. Endless amounts of paperwork. He actually says, gods and devils, why did no one tell me that kingship entails this dreary drudgery? So help me, I'd almost rather be a pirate on the Main. And his advisor very wisely warns him, even the lightest crown sits heavily sometimes, my lord king. A ruler has to rule, or another will govern in his stead. The late Numidides shirked his proper task, and he was, and Conan interrupts him and says, yes, yes, I suppose you're right, Crom, curse it. And he says, now, the treasury statements first. And this is the way the issue ends, with this great panel. Look at that. That is awesome. Absolutely awesome. Papers strewn everywhere, the ornate desk, the full moon, and Conan disgruntled, settling into being a king. Just wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I loved it. Loved the issue. We also get some Ernie Chan artwork, original Ernie Chan pinups in this issue. These old Savage Shores of Conan really gave you a lot of extras. There's Robert E. Howard's loser hero, Solomon Kane. Then we have Conan confronting Yog-Kosha in the Tower of the Elephant. What else we got here? The Femme Fatales of Conan, Valeria, Belit, and Red Sonja. Neat. Just sort of neat things here. Here we have King Kull with his tiger totem. And Conan from A Witch Shall Be Born, that famous scene from A Witch Shall Be Born. And then we have the letters page, which may or may not include a missive from yours truly. So that is my foray for today. Conan becomes king. So all is well. I have not hit a dud in a while. I'm going to keep going. We're going to finish out the last week of Cimmerian September. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I will see you next time. Thank you, BookTube.